Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. How are you guys doing tonight? How are you guys doing tonight? Welcome to Heal Black Joy Thursday Talks, and in today's conversation we are going to be discussing boundaries and black men, such a taboo subject. Hi, I'm Lola Troy, the curator and host of Heal Black Joy, the learning platform for our community to heal our black joy with tangible and attainable programs for the mind, body, soul, relationship, and businesses. And today our guest is Mr. Damian McGee. Damian is a boundaries coach, author of Move Over, I'm Driving, a roadmap for reclaiming control over your life. He travels the country as a motivational speaker and trains men and women on how to establish healthy boundaries for themselves and others. So I'm going to see if I can get him in here. Hi,
Hey, can you hear me?
I can. How are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you?
I am great. It is
Good.
so good to be talking to you again.
You as well. You as well. I enjoyed the last time.
I know, man. We had such a good conversation about boundaries, and I didn't want to do it with anybody else because you are the boundaries expert.
I appreciate it.
The things that I learned on our last conversation, I have literally put into practice,
Nice.
and I talk about those things with people often.
Nice. Nice. Glad to
So
hear it.
I'm super duper excited about having this conversation with you.
Absolutely.
This month, as you know, has been my ode to black men.
Hmm.
And I wanted to convey two things. One, I just wanted to say that we appreciate you, we see you, we hear you. Bridging the gap was a really main thing for me. Like, I wanted to bridge the gap between black men and black women because there's this great divide with how we communicate with each other, how we treat each other, how we speak with each other. And I also wanted to like bring up subject matters that, you know, that you guys experience on a day-to-day basis, whether it's
Right.
family. We've talked about mental health. We've talked about grief and depression this month. Last week's conversation was super duper important. We were talking about the fatherless generation, the generation of kids that grow up in their families without their father in the home. And we talked to a reunification expert, the number one reunification expert in the country, who
Hmm.
has unified over 8,000 children with 3,000 fathers. So it was just a really, really, really good conversation. And like as always, I wanted to have this conversation, those taboo conversations that we don't typically have. And boundaries and black men, that's provocative as well as something that we don't talk about in our community.
Right.
Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I completely agree. Whether it's how we set them or how we receive them.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
both aspects of that are super important.
yeah. Um, I put up a tip today and it said, boundaries promote a sense of autonomy in that you are in control as far as possible in what you want and don't want. They can also keep you safe in relationships at home, work, with partners, and that is very important. What do you think about that particular statement, and how does that play out in the black male psyche?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's all true, and I think it's true for anybody. Setting healthy boundaries, communicating those boundaries, does give you a sense of, you could say, confidence, if you will, to move forward, knowing that you've set the parameters for how you want others to interact with you.
Right.
What I think is important, though, is some people think by setting boundaries, you are guaranteeing that you're going to get what you want, or you're
Mhm.
guaranteeing that people are going to abide by those boundaries.
Right.
That is not how that works. What you're actually doing, in my opinion, what you're doing is giving yourself a space so that you know how to interact and how to how to cut off people, how to stop interacting with people, how to remind people of those boundaries, how to decide who stays, who goes, what relationships are healthy and what aren't. The more clear your boundaries are, the easier it is for you to draw those lines and for you to walk away or for you to say enough is enough. And I think when people don't do that, that's where a lot of that confusion comes from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What do you think about, like, I know you are a boundaries coach, and when you're talking to men, what are those things that they struggle with in particular when it comes to setting boundaries or just knowing that they have the opportunity to have boundaries? Like, what is that conversation like?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that I think are probably most important, and both of which I've dealt with in my own life before getting here, and I won't even say that they don't flare up every once in a while. Um, but I think the first one is don't be a hypocrite, right? Don't set boundaries that you're not going to adhere to yourself. And when you talk about men and relationships, that there are a lot of those, right? Whether that is what you can and can't do, um, the desire to be faithful or infidelity or whatever, set boundaries that you yourself are going to adhere to and are going to be an example of. I think that's number one. Number two, I would say that clearly communicating boundaries is the single most important aspect of boundaries. Everyone's worried about what the boundary should be, what should it pertain to, what aspect of life is most important, which boundary is most important. None of that matters if you don't know how to clearly communicate it. And so when it comes to men specifically, I think a couple things are important in that volume does not equate to clarity, right? So being loud
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean I'm being clear. Being assertive doesn't mean I'm being effective. And so we have to learn how to communicate our boundaries in a way where we can be sure that the recipient is actually getting the message, that the recipient is actually understanding what I'm saying, not that I dominated the situation. Because you may have
Right.
dominated the situation and conveyed nothing. No one
Right.
understands what the point was.
That is so key, because last week, and my sister is on, Dr. Tori is on, and she talked about how men, specifically with fathers, like they'll have boundaries, but because of guilt, because they might not have been in the home or whatever, they don't know how to keep the boundary.
Yeah.
Like, their children might run over them out of guilt. Like, I don't really want to enforce discipline with my child because I'm not there every single day. And I'm just letting my child run amok and letting my child get away with things that they typically wouldn't get away with if I were in the home. Have you seen or discussed that with fathers or, parents, that
Yeah.
have a problem with setting boundaries and keeping and sticking to those boundaries when it comes to their children?
Absolutely. I think, and it's funny because I think there's two sides to that. I think there's the side that you mentioned where people they set boundaries but they don't adhere to them, they don't stick to them, they're not consistent, and there are a lot of reasons for that. It could be their own guilt, it could be their own sense of lack, and so they feel like by giving this other thing, it makes up for what is lacking on this other side. One of the craziest excuses I've ever heard, and it makes sense to me, but I just fundamentally disagree with it, is when you talk about people with, let's say, a lower income or less disposable income, and you'll say, well, if you spend this much money on something healthy, it's better for your kids, but if you spend it on McDonald's or whatever, it's the same thing. And people will say to you, well, yeah, but if that's all they have, sometimes giving that McDonald's is the only thing they can give them. And I'm just like,
Mm,
I get it. Like, I get where you're coming from, but
yeah.
if the only thing I can give my kid is something unhealthy, I may need to figure out another way to give them something, right? And
Right.
so we do things out of lack. But I think the other side, and this is something that I dealt with, is it's almost the exact opposite of what you're saying. It's not those who won't adhere to the boundaries they've set. It's those who hold on to them for too long and aren't willing to have conversations and understand when they need to adjust. There are times when you realize, your kids are becoming adults, your kids are becoming, they're forming their own identities, and let's be honest, the world is not the same. And so things that we thought we would do, things that we thought should be the rules, things that we were taught when we were kids. The more educated, the more informed you become, the more you realize maybe that's not right. And so, but it's hard when you've held on to that boundary and that principle forever, and you swore this is how you were going to do it. It's very difficult to take a look in the mirror and say, you know what, maybe that's not the way to do this. And how do I now reevaluate? How do I change? How do I not only look within to do something differently, but then how do I also communicate that to my kids or to my family that, hey, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I need to do something differently. And I think that's something that when you talk about men and black men especially, we really got to get better about standing up and saying that we messed up and we're not doing it right.
Oh man, let me tell you. If you grew up in the 70s and the 80s in a black household, we all grew up the same. We had the James Evans
Yep.
approach to
Yep.
parenting, right?
Yep.
And with that being said, a lot of that stemmed from our parents doing things out of survival.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so they had extreme sense of not necessarily boundaries, but extreme sense of rules, which when we got older and we became parents, we were trying to enforce these same rules upon our children in a different day and age where it just doesn't translate the same way.
Right.
I myself, being a single parent or divorced mother, I was doing the same thing that I saw growing up, modeling behavior after my mother and my father, because now I'm the enforcer, I'm the protector, I'm the provider in this household. So I'm using this extreme measure of rules that's
Yep.
not working with my child. And she was the greatest teacher to me about setting boundaries, having those boundaries set for her, and knowing that I needed to make that adjustment. I
Right.
know a lot of times black men, because of growing up in the 70s, especially my age group of men, they stick with that, I'm going to be harsh because I'm the protector, I'm the provider. I have to do it this way because this is how it's always been done. But how is that really working for you?
Yeah. And the funny thing is it may accomplish what you wanted to accomplish. What we fail to realize is that what we thought we wanted to accomplish may not be what we needed to accomplish, right? And so for
Mm,
example, when you talk about growing up in that time span, right? One of the things is that kids are seen, not heard, right? Like you don't talk, you don't get in grown people's conversations and all this kind of stuff. And I think there's an aspect of that has to do with manners and respect and whatever, but it also just had to do with the fact that you're a kid, you don't know anything, whatever. Well, then you flip that on its head. Number one, these kids know stuff and are dealing with social issues that we never had to even consider in our childhood. And
right.
number two, how are we then telling our kids that you need to be open and talk to me when we spend the other 23 and a half hours telling them to shut up and stay out of my conversations? So, yeah, are you going to accomplish them learning to be quiet and stay out of grown folks' business and blah, blah, blah? Probably. But what you need is an open dialogue, and you're not going to create that if you hold on to those types of rules and boundaries. And so it takes growth, but it takes growth from us, and it takes an acknowledgement of saying, it doesn't mean everything I'm doing wrong. It doesn't mean I'm going to flip it all upside down, but at least having the ability to step back and say, is this the only way to do things? And then is it the best way to do them?
That's good. I put up some examples of some personal boundaries this week, and I got so much feedback in my DMs from guys who were like, wait a minute, I could do this. Like, I didn't know that this is a real thing, right? So I'm going to read them out to you, and I want you
Okay.
to we can go one by one and we can talk about it.
Okay.
One of them was, you have the right to privacy. You
Yes.
have a right to privacy. That is an example of a personal boundary. Um, One man in particular was just like, when I come home, I don't have a place to decompress. Like, my kids are running rampant. My wife is like, throwing her day at me.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how to communicate to her and to them that I need a moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes,
So,
you know what? Sometimes it's just my goal is to get every boundary into two sentences. Every boundary.
Okay, I
What
think I lost you for a second. So say what
can you
you
hear
just
me?
said again. I can hear you
Oh,
now.
so when I work with people to communicate their boundaries, my goal is to get everyone, or is to get every boundary into two sentences. State the boundary and state the desire or the need for the boundary. And a lot of
Okay.
people think, well, I don't want to justify my boundaries. I don't want to have to. I'm not asking anyone to justify anything, but just stating a boundary is an assumption that the receiver understands where you're coming from and why, right?
Hmm.
So if I come home and I say, give me a minute, let's say that's an ineffective way of communicating my boundary, but I say, look, everybody needs to give me a minute. That I've set a boundary, but no one understands why I need the minute. No
Why
one
you need the minute?
understands, right? They're just, now I'm just the a-hole in this situation, and
Right.
oh, here he's tripping again and whatever, right? As opposed to saying, listen, it's Sunday, we're sitting down, we're having dinner. Here's the deal. When I get home, I need 30 minutes to myself. It's so I can forget about the stuff I was dealing with at work and then actively engage in everything y'all want me to engage in for the rest of the night. Two sentences.
Mm.
That's all it takes.
That is a great example of how to communicate that to your family, men. If you are struggling with how do I communicate that with family? So hopefully you guys are paying attention to those two sentences.
Yep.
So the next one, you have the ability to change your mind.
Absolutely. 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 Now, did they give you parameters or a situation where they were talking about? Is this
No, that
relationship? Is this personal work? Is this,
it could be any scenario. You can
yeah.
expound on any scenario.
No, and I think the rule applies regardless. You absolutely have your right to change your mind. Um, I would argue you don't have the right to be inconsistent, right? So don't set a boundary and then when you get it, then change it, and then when they adhere to that, change it, and then when they're doing what you want, change it. That's not the same thing to me. That's inconsistent. But what you do, if you use the example we talked about before, where you say, "Hey, listen, kids are not supposed to be heard. They need to sit over here," and then you do reading and you go to counseling and you do all these things and you learn that maybe that's not the best way. You do have a right to say, "Okay, kids, you know what? Let's scratch that. You're allowed to sit at the table with us. You're allowed to be in these conversations. But if you do it, you need to say, excuse me first, and you need to understand that you might not be open to all the, or allowed to be in all the conversations." That's a shift in the boundary. It shows that you're respecting them. It shows that things might be different, but it also gives you a way to communicate that. But that goes with anybody. And in fact, here's the thing. You should be changing your mind. If you are dealing with a boundary or dealing with a person and you set a boundary 10 years ago and it hasn't shifted at all, not all
Right.
boundaries, some boundaries will not change.
Right.
Your own growth and development should cause you to adjust some boundaries. Not
Right.
only what you know that you're capable of giving, but what you know you need from somebody else. And so if you can go that long, 10, 15, I'd say 5 years, and nothing has adjusted, I would question how much growth you've been doing over that time, because I think it's going to be a natural change in understanding, requirements, desires, and just if I'm a better me, I want to give something different. So you know what? Let's shift these boundaries. I was being a little bit extreme. I wasn't being open enough. Whatever the case may be.
Right. Right. This one I got a lot of feedback on because of what has transpired in some of the men's lives that they don't typically want to discuss. And that is the freedom to express sexual boundaries.
Yes, yes. So I was molested as a kid, um, and it you go through. I went through. I mean, everyone's situation I think is different,
Hmm.
but I think generally speaking, I can say there's a process of working through that for everybody. Everybody's process is different. Um, but when you've dealt with trauma, you have a competing ideology that sexual relationships or something of that nature may not look to you like they look to everybody else, right? They
Exactly.
don't they don't have the same meaning behind them. They don't have the same emotions behind them. You don't have the same limits. You don't have the same level of comfort. So I think that's one aspect. And then two, being a man, there's this expectation of things that not all men choose to adhere to, right? There's an expectation of conquering. There's an expectation of racking up numbers. There's an expectation of being able to use and abuse, and not every man adheres to that. And so you not only are you allowed to, you should set boundaries that say, this is the way I'm going to live my life, right? And I think that brings me to one of the most important aspects of this. Whenever people say boundaries, there's an automatic external approach to that. People think boundaries are only about what I will allow you to do to me. The most important boundaries you will set are the ones where you tell you what you're willing to do, what you're going to do, and what you're not going to do. Because boundaries to someone else without boundaries for yourself don't mean anything. How do you tell your significant other what they will and won't spend the money on, but you can't manage the budget? You have to set boundaries for you first.
Right.
And so when you talk about sexuality and your sex life and romance, that's one of those things. What do I want to represent? What do I want to stand for? What am I comfortable with? What am I okay with? And being able to express that.
I know that I was, and this, since I started Heal Black Joy and since I've done this ode to Black men, and we talked about mental health and some of the traumas that Black men have experienced, and a lot of that was sexual trauma. And because of that, they were apprehensive to speak about that particular thing. So I'm glad that we can have this discussion now about it, because it gives them, one, some context, and it also gives them the freedom to be able to express themselves and hopefully, be able to talk to someone about their trauma, one, and two, set boundaries when it comes to, to their sexual activities.
Yeah. I mean,
so
if you don't, here's the thing. If you don't set boundaries for aspects of your life, everyone will set them for you, right? So as a Black male, when it comes to sexuality, if you don't set the parameters from which you choose to operate, in which you're comfortable operating, then this society is going to over-sexualize you anyway, and they will treat you like a prop if that's how you allow yourself to be treated.
I was getting ready to say that. Like, in general, society has it where men are overly sexualized from a very young age. There are things that you guys are exposed to from a very, very young age. And it seems to be, this standard thing like, oh, you can get a notch on your belt at a certain age and it's okay because you're a man, right? If it was a girl, then it's shunned upon. But if it's a guy, it's not shunned upon. And sometimes that is sexual trauma that they're experiencing. And then when they become adults, they don't know how to express it. They're like, they don't really know what to do with the trauma. They don't feel comfortable of dealing with that trauma. So if there are men that are dealing with this, and I know that there are men that are dealing with this because they have shared that with me, and I want them, of course, to feel comfortable enough to be able to talk to me about it and not necessarily put the information out, but also want to be able to address it so that they can feel comfortable having those conversations. So what do you say to those men? How do we put a button on it? What would be the first step in them becoming comfortable talking about, one, their sexual trauma, also being able to set their sexual boundaries when it comes to dealing with sexual activity?
I would say, until you are willing to have a conversation about your sexual trauma, you are going to use an appendage to find closure that you're not going to find. It's not going to do that. It's not going to fill that void. It's not going to fill that hole. It's not going to address those issues. Now, the environment in which you feel you need to have the conversation, that is up to you. But I'm telling you, as a person who has gone through it himself, who still goes to therapy about things, you have to have that conversation. Because again, not only do you not know how to deal with it personally, but society is not going to help you. They're going to tell you, one of my favorites is when people say, oh, men think about sex all the time. That's all they think about. You know what I spent most of my day thinking about is making sure I got my fantasy football set up before tomorrow. Like, and how long the turkey's supposed to be in the smoker. Like, I cannot get that wrong, right?
Right.
So there's this idea that, and then what's crazy is if you play into it for too long, then you're looking at everybody and you're like, oh, I should be thinking about how to conquer this. I should be thinking about how to acquire this. I should be, I had a friend of mine. She was my old boss, and she's a good friend of mine. And one of the most powerful conversations we ever had was, she was like, why do men not understand that? Now, we're not talking about gender roles and religious beliefs, and I'm talking about any of that. But her general statement was that men need to understand that, like, I don't go out or I don't exist for them to then conquer me. That's not why I'm here. And it was just like, and you think about it as a man, and think about the way that many men view women as parts, as which part is bigger or better or this or that, and like you said, how many. It's all these very dehumanizing qualifications for each other, because it comes back the other way. And that, like you said, that's also the trauma. The trauma is, how many have you done? How early were you when you started? Did you get it? What you mean she said no? Oh, why haven't you gotten it yet? It's all of this stuff that you're trying to figure out your identity, and you're battling what everyone else is telling you should be doing. And so you have to be able to talk about the trauma, because no matter how well you think you are dealing with your own sexuality, you're never going to be able to tie the emotional part to it which is the healthy part of it,
Right.
until you deal with whatever that hole and that gap is that usually trauma causes in all of us.
And why? So I'm going to ask this question. This is a follow-up question to that.
Yeah.
Because they haven't dealt with the trauma, they're now taking it upon themselves. A lot of men take it upon themselves to act out physically or sexually because they have not really addressed the trauma. I think this conversation is shifting, but I think it's good to address now, because a lot of times they don't even understand that what they've experienced was trauma, one, because it was forced upon them from, like, maybe their father or their uncle or their older brother that says, hey, you need to do this. And they're thinking, okay, because my brother did it, or because my dad did it, or my uncle did it, now I'm in the good boys club because I've experienced this at a very, very young age. And they don't even identify that as trauma, right?
Right.
That was a conversation that we had on the mental health discussion a couple of weeks ago, where a lot of men were just like, yeah, I did that when I was 12. I did that when I was 13. I lost my virginity, to an older woman. But they don't want to address the fact that that's statutory rape.
I was 12. Let me see. So I was molested, but then my first situation with a female, I was 12 or 13. She was 19. And same thing. And it's funny that you say that, because I remember being a kid and just being so proud of this thing, right? Like, because that's how it was presented.
Right.
And then I remember once I had my own sons, and I was just like, do you understand if I came home and saw a 19-year-old girl with my 12-year-old son? Like,
she's going to jail.
What? if we get there, yes.
If we get there, exactly.
But when it's your child, that changes. It should change that concept. Now, there's still men who are like, yeah, get it, congratulations. No, not at all. Once you understand the difference between, the psyche of a child and the psyche of an adult, there's no way you can celebrate that at all. There's nothing to celebrate. But I think you're right. And that starts with our families not having these conversations, and our what's funny is we are way too forgiving as a people, right? And so, and I'm not, for those who go to church and say God said forgive and that's all they worry about, I respect that. I'm not combating that. What I'm
Right.
saying though is because even for those who are taking it from a religious perspective, there is still penance that has to be paid. There is still, you still have to deal with the consequences of your actions. And so, when you think about a 19-year-old girl who's sleeping with your 12-year-old son, or, how we sweep sexual assault and molestation under the rug in our families, like we're letting our communities get away with victimizing our communities and then wondering why we are perpetually in the same state all the time. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's why.
Mm-hmm. We're not having the conversations. And if you're thinking about growing up in a black family, especially in the 70s and 80s, I mean, it's generation of our
Yeah,
generation, our parents, we didn't have boundaries. They had rules, but they didn't have boundaries,
true.
right?
And there was no
Um,
understanding of the rules or the boundaries. You just had to because you had to.
right, right.
Right.
And there was no explanation of what it was. It was just, this is what your rule is. If you don't adhere to this rule, the consequences are that. So you
Exactly.
didn't feel like you had any type of autonomy whatsoever. I saw my other sister join as well. Our mother wounds coach, Jennifer, welcome sis. She talked about you cannot you cannot be self-aware when you're in survival mode because you have all these wounds, right? And
Yep.
you don't have autonomy. It's like the mother wound and the father wound comes because one, they didn't have autonomy over what they were living out in their
Mm-hmm.
life with their parents, and then they modeled that behavior after their parents, and then they taught it to us. So now we have mother wounds and father wounds that we haven't dealt with, and there's no autonomy. She says yes, no autonomy equals wounding all the time.
Yep.
So
Yep.
when you don't have autonomy, that means you don't have any boundaries. There were no boundaries set within the family dynamic, which means that, like she said, it ends up with mother and father wounds, and we're playing those things out every single day.
Well, and
Um,
when we're in survival mode, I think when you talk about black men specifically, and I have no doubt black women go through this, but when we're focusing on black men, I think what's interesting is because you've been raised in and lived in survival mode for so long, for whatever the reason is, it doesn't even matter how successful you become, because you're not having these conversations, because we're not talking about these things, you don't realize that you're into your six-figure salary and living in the suburbs and still living in survival mode. It just doesn't feel like it because everything is nicer now. But you have to, I had to acknowledge, and that was one of the things that I ended up working on when I was in therapy, was the fact that, like, yeah, you're doing great, but part of that doing great is you still think like you are in survival mode daily. And then add in the fact that I spent 12 years in the Marines, like that just takes it up another notch. And so
right, right.
so you have to have the conversation so that you can even realize that that's what you're doing and that's how you're approaching life. But when we talk about all this, I think what's interesting to me is if everyone is honest with themselves, we've only attached the word trauma to men in the last year or two. Like, what?
Right.
When is, what I'm saying? Like, we can
Yeah.
act like there's this thing that needs to be happening. Men are so behind, and why aren't we doing this? And it's like nobody ever said man and trauma in the same sentence in my entire life, and I'm 42 years old. So the not only is it important, but it's so new that we need to normalize it so that we can say like, oh, I guess that is trauma, because the idea of being traumatized and being a man were never in the same space.
It wasn't, like she said, it's so rooted in anti-blackness and system racial objectification. You were talking about just normalizing. We're in survival mode. I remember, getting to a place where I was in therapy, and she was like, it's okay to just like relax, right?
Mm-hmm.
I remember going on vacation and feeling guilty about being on vacation and not actually being able to relax. I felt like I needed to do something.
Yep.
I needed to be engaging in something
Yep.
because I didn't understand what relaxation was all about. Like,
Yep.
I self-care was not a part of self-care, is just now becoming a thing Just like trauma being attached to men is becoming, we have the verbiage now. We know what wounding is, mother wounds and father wounds, and we know what childhood trauma is. But I noticed this month in having these conversations specifically with Black men, they're so taboo. The men are literally like engaging in conversation last week. Like, I didn't realize this was really trauma.
When my therapist first told me that those were traumas that I had dealt with, the way I equated trauma, and again, some of this might have to do with my military background, but as far as I was concerned, there were no scars, right? Trauma on TV has blood and bullet wounds and an ambulance and doctors. Like, no, I'm standing upright, been standing upright my entire life. What I didn't realize is that while there were no external wounds, there were all kinds of bullet holes and blood on the inside.
I was getting
and I needed to find a doctor to repair it all.
Ooh.
But that's not how we look at trauma, especially as a man. If there is no blood, then you need to figure it out. And that's what we teach each other. That's what we've been teaching for so long, and it's so wrong.
Can we even go a step further? Even if there is blood with men and Black men specifically, even if there is blood, they carry that wound like it's, a badge of honor. Like, I survived this. Like, I don't care that I'm getting hurt. I survived this thing, right? Yeah. But they don't realize internally what it's doing to them. I don't think Black men really realize what it's doing to them internally and how it comes across or translates externally.
I don't even know if it's, so yes, you're right. We don't realize it, but it's not, I don't think it's due to lack of understanding or lack of desire to understand. I think it goes back to what you were saying about survival mode. No one, I want to say it was on your page, but I saw this video this week where it was a kind of a string of men talking about, like, nobody cares when I'm down. Nobody cares when I'm right. Like, that's the world we live in. And here's what's funny. Think about, and this is not anyone's fault, but I think sometimes we just have to sit back and watch how things play out, right? So there's a push for men to not have toxic masculinity, right? Whatever that is. I will admit in an open forum, I still don't know what that means, but I'm trying to figure it out and just make sure I don't offend people on a daily basis. But I have 2 female employees, and I ask them every other day, like, am I good? Okay. All right. We're good. But so on one side, it's like, don't have the toxic masculinity. On the other side, it is, where's the knight in shining armor? Where's the pursuer? On the other side, it's the, hey, if you're approaching me, then you're creepy and leave me alone. On the other side, it's, when are you going to put in the effort? And why don't men try anymore? And then on the other side, it's, oh my God, I can't believe he's trying. He's so thirsty. And so as a guy, you're just like, yeah, I don't even know what we're doing anymore.
You don't even know what to do anymore.
At all. And so think about that when it comes to just the pursuit of women. You take that deeper when dealing with your own trauma or your own issues. I'm balancing all of this, and let's be honest, the person that we most need to talk to is another woman. Another guy isn't who we need to talk to. We need a woman to tell us things are going to be okay. We need somebody to say it's all right for you to be vulnerable. Your boys are, even if they tell you it's okay to be vulnerable, like, that's not what you need to hear. That's not where you need to hear it from, right? So if you're balancing all these situations between potential women you may engage with, what in the world makes you think that you're like, you know what, I should be open with this person about my trauma?
You're hitting it, but you're hitting it because when we had this grief conversation, oh my God, he said something that was so key. Robert Fields stated that when you're experiencing trauma or going through grief or dealing with, a particular situation where, your emotions are high, he says he will stand the field. Like, he will be the person that keeps his it's even keel, just so that women have that ability to have their emotions run amok,
You have
because
to.
that's what men are taught to
You have
basically
to.
kind of stand their ground and kind of hold their grief and hold their emotions at that time, right?
Yeah.
And you guys never get a chance to do, ever get a chance to like express your grief or express your emotions or frustration. And even with the great divide of the communication between Black women and Black men, because of that, we're not really creating that safe space for you guys to be able to express. When you do feel comfortable enough to express, we're not giving you that space to do it.
We listen. Yes, you are correct, and I think, and I know this is not a relationship episode, but when it comes to those types of things, in my opinion, we really need to get back to prioritizing what we want and not who we want. If you say, I want someone who is open, I want someone who can communicate, I want someone who can express themselves, then engage in people who communicate and express themselves. And you know what? They might not look the way you thought they were going to look. They might not be where you thought they were going to be. And that's okay, because if you choose to go for who you want, understand you then may not get what you want. Like, you can't. Now, here's the thing. There's going to be somebody on your timeline that's going to be like, nope, my man has both. He's who and what and this and that. Congratulations. That's not the average situation for the rest of us, right?
And I think that's also the definition. When you describe what you want, it's also giving you great definition of a boundary. Like,
those are the boundaries.
that is the
What
boundary
I tell people,
itself.
when you set boundaries, so when someone works with me on setting boundaries, the very first question I ask them is, what do you want? Every boundary has to be set from what you want. Where we mess up is we set boundaries based on what happened to us. We set boundaries based on where we're from. We set boundaries based on what somebody said. That's not how you set a boundary. That's a safety net. That's a protective situation. That's revenge. That's everything but a boundary. The way you set a boundary is you start with, this is what I want. This is where I want to be. This is where I want to go. This is the type of person I want in my life. Okay, now let me think about the things that play into those situations. What is required to execute those things? And anything that is not required to execute those things, guess what? You just created your boundary because it's on the wrong side of the line. It's just that simple. That's what we're dealing with. We're not dealing with, and this is, again, people start from the wrong place. I'll give you an example real quick. I had a friend of mine who she was just a super nice person, right? Like, she just was a giving human being. But she wouldn't set boundaries, right? So she would be the type that, like, oh, well, I'm going to cook. I met a guy and I'm going to cook dinner for him every night. And then I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that for him. And none of which I think are an issue. But then the second that relationship would go wrong, then she would say, well, I'm not cooking it for anybody else. Do you honestly think that meal is what made this person do what they did? The problem was, you didn't set the boundary that says, if I make you a meal, you got to eat it with me and sit here at the table and have a conversation with me. You cook the meal, they act like you weren't a priority. You made them a to-go plate and they took it somewhere else. The meal wasn't the problem, right? So what do you want? If you set it on the wrong end, if you set it after you're hurt, after you've gone through pain, then what you start doing is figuring out, what can I do or require that will protect me and keep me in a safe space? That's all you're doing. You're not setting a boundary, nor are you allowing yourself the room to grow and flourish, because you're restricted by the same walls you think are keeping everybody else out.
God knows this is something good. This is so good, you guys. So the quotable for tonight is, you need to set your boundaries on what we want and not who we want.
Exactly.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. All right. The next personal boundaries that we're going to talk about is the freedom to express spiritual boundaries.
Yes. Yeah. It's funny. We grew up, I grew up in a community where the only thing everybody talked about was you have to be evenly yoked. If the person doesn't do exactly what you do and go to church as much as you go to church, and it's not going to work and whatever, which I always thought was funny, watching how many preachers got divorced and how many people in the church were having affairs. And I was like, I don't think that's, I don't think that's
not
the
it.
answer, right?
Right.
But I do think, you know, the freedom to have religious boundaries and comes back to mutual respect, right? So it's not it's not a requirement of someone else all the time. Everyone thinks a boundary is what you're asking someone else to do. But if you and I are in a relationship, I can say, you know what, listen, what I require is the ability to read my Bible and pray every day for 10 minutes. That's what I need. I didn't say you have to do it.
Right.
I didn't say that I need you to be there with me. What I said is, if you respect me and if we're going to do this and we're going to have these boundaries, you need to give me that 10 minutes and you need to respect that. And if you say, you know what, that's fine. Please do not try to drag me to church every Sunday morning. That is your boundary. Like,
right.
Everybody thinks that the answer has to be this exact same thing. It doesn't. It just needs to be a mutual level of respect that says, here's what I need. And I need you to love and respect me enough to allow me to create that space and maintain it. Now, if you're running in every day in the middle of my 10 minutes being like, I know you got that prayer thing going on, but you need to get this phone call. I know you're about to read your Bible, but the kids need it. Now you don't respect my boundary.
Right.
It has nothing to do with you believing the same thing I believe or going to church when I go to church. It's a simple boundary, and I'm allowed to express and have that boundary.
Yeah. My sis Jennifer said, first, each person is to be doing the work consistently. If not, then it will be out of balance. Everybody has to be actively healing because it creates clarity. And life coaching, Debbie Sass says, grown folks' conversation of speaking our truth and not our trauma. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people speak from a place of trauma, like their filter, everything is from their trauma. So, like you were saying, your girlfriend is setting boundaries based off of what she experienced.
What happened to her, right?
What happened to her,
right.
Which was traumatic for her. So she's just like, I'm going to cut off who I really am, who I enjoy cooking and I enjoy doing these nice things, but I'm going to stop doing it. It's just like, no, you can still do it, but
in
don't
fact, you
base
should
it
do
off
it more. Here's
right.
my thing. The more and we've all done it. I've done it. Every time we go through something traumatic, we take a piece of ourselves and we set it on the shelf because we think that might be the reason that caused the trauma, right? So someone treated me poorly in a relationship. It has to be because I did that thing, or because I was too nice, or because I was too naive, or whatever. So I take that piece of me and I set it over to the side because I don't need that to cause that problem again, right? And you can translate that to most traumas. The problem is, when you do that enough times, you will end up with someone who is perfectly willing to deal with the skeleton version of you that remains. The problem is, now you don't understand why you're not happy, because now you're looking back and you're like, well, wait, I don't actually like this. They love me, but I don't like them. The problem is, they don't love you. All of you is sitting over on the shelf because you're scared to show it anymore because you think that's what caused your trauma. What you did is you took the skeletal version and said, hey, can you work with this? And they were like, hell yeah, that's easy. I don't have to deal with these things. I don't have to engage you. I don't have to have real conversations. I don't have to deal with your trauma. I don't have to talk about your past or your emotions or appreciate you for the nice things you do, because you've stripped all that away. Now we just got to be cute and look good on social media and kick it and do our thing. And we're going to keep all our money separate and our business separate. This is easy.
And hashtag goals, right?
Yep.
Whoa, you just said a mouthful right there.
You cannot strip you every time someone misuses or abuses that part of you. Now, that does not mean you don't evaluate how you got there. That doesn't mean you don't evaluate the type of people that you're attracting who would misuse that. But don't go away from that, because that's who you are. And so what you really want is, when it's all said and done, to be surrounded around people who all of those things that made you vulnerable or you believe made you vulnerable are the same things that they applaud and they love about you. That's when you become free. That's when you truly get to be who you are.
You said something that was such an eye opener the last time, and I would love for you to expound upon it this time because I think it was transformative. It was probably the biggest thing that has stuck with me from our conversation.
Pledging
And that,
allegiance.
no, yes, sir.
I already know.
Having an allegiance versus having a relationship.
Yes.
Can you talk about that and how people just run amok when they don't set that boundary and they decide, especially like now, like this is prime time to set boundaries during the holidays
Yeah.
because a lot of times people will go to places and do things and have experiences that they really don't want to do it, but they'll do it anyway out of allegiance. So can you
Yeah.
talk about that for a second?
Yeah. No, I think, and it's funny that you bring that back up, especially because we're supposed to focus on Black men, and I would say we are one of the biggest culprits of pledging allegiance to things that serve us no purpose. We will pledge allegiance to a block or a neighborhood that we don't own. We will pledge allegiance to a lifestyle that is guaranteed to cut our lives short. We will pledge allegiance to a group of men or group of like-minded individuals who will sell us up the river at the first chance they get. Like we are so, and I honestly, I will say, I don't know where that comes from to its absolute origin, but I know it is probably one of the most destructive things that we do, and that is pledging this blind allegiance to things and people to the extent that we are willing to sacrifice healthy interactions and healthy relationships. How many times, even growing up, and it's kind of childish, but in your early 20s, how many times do you hear guys being like, I mean, she's cool, but my boy said that she's this, so I can't. Wait, what? I don't understand, right?
Right.
And my uncle used to teach me when I was a kid, the only person who goes to bed with and wakes up with this person is me. Therefore, the only permission and justification I need for what I do is me and them, right? But we take this allegiance to things that do not serve us, do not bring us healing, do not bring us, they may bring you temporary satisfaction and temporary pleasure, but it's not long term. And the most important thing, and I think the most damaging thing, is we're pledging allegiance to things that can't give it back. When you pledge allegiance, you are giving, you are saying, I am in this. And when that thing either is incapable or unwilling to give it back, you will be left empty. It's not a question. It's not a maybe. I'm not telling you there's a chance. I am guaranteeing you will be left without because nothing is pouring back into you. But you have a blind allegiance to something that can't or won't.
Why do men, particularly Black men, feel the need to pledge a blind allegiance to a block or to a group of men that they're not getting anything from, they're not gaining anything from? Like we've noticed in, the last few weeks, a rapper that got shot in his hometown. It's the common thing where guys are just dying on the street
Yeah.
based off of the block. I'm pledging allegiance to this block, but they're not getting anything from that block. And it's some of those people that have been in your circle that could have sold you out and been the person that says, hey, he's going to be here on this day buying cookies. And now he's dead and his children have no father and his wife has no husband. Like, what is that about? Why is our men in particular dying at alarming rates based off of pledging a blind allegiance?
I think it's a couple things. I think some of that blind allegiance offers you a community of other men which our community is always lacking when men are growing up, right? So that's the simplest explanation. Um, and to be completely honest, and most men won't admit this, anything other than that is scary. You have to, in order for you to not live a life in which you pledge allegiance to the block, let's say, you have to be willing to go live in a space where people may not look like you, or the zip code is not one you're familiar with, or the expectations of you are going to be way higher than they've ever been. And so what's ironic is people, and somebody said it, Soul Man NYC said they want to be a part of a community. And I agree with that. The problem is too many of us have convinced ourselves that that's the only way our community looks.
Ooh.
I'm in a community of Black men every Sunday morning at 7:30 in the morning. There's about 30 of us. There's not a person on there who's not either in the process of, has already started, or is drastically expanding a business. There's not a person on there who can't tell you their goals for 2021 and 2022 and probably the next 5 years. Like, community is what we want. So Soul Man NYC is correct. The problem is we don't take the time to understand that this isn't the only community that exists. It's the one where we're most comfortable. It's the one that we know. And again, anything outside of that is scary, and it requires effort. It requires you to go look for another community. In fact, it might even require you to stand out on your own for a while until you find that other community. But we're too scared to separate from one community in search of the other community, not realizing that being trapped in this community most likely will guarantee you never find the other community. So it's this in-between space. It's this, when I decide I'm no longer going to pledge allegiance to this thing in search of something else. Remember I said, you start with what do you want? That space is scary because you don't know when you're going to get to the other community. You don't know when that other group is going to be there. You don't know how far you got to go before they show up. But for anybody listening, for anybody who's worried about that, I promise you, there is another community waiting for you on the other end. You just got to walk that direction.
Right.
You have to walk a different direction than you've been walking.
Right. Instagram is not going to allow us to be super great tonight. We have had
5:57. Yep.
Yeah, we've had such a great conversation. As always, tell us how we can reach you. Give us your information, what you're working on, so that these fine people on here that don't know Damian McGee as the Boundaries Expert, they need to know, because I mean, you're the person that understands this so well. And I would love for everybody in the Heal Black Joy community to go and follow him. His handle is on everything that we posted this week. Please go follow him. What are you working on, real quick?
I am actually working on, and Fresh Dream 88 just mentioned it, I am actually working on rebranding a community of people who are just trying to move forward and create their own boundaries. And again, starting from where they want to be. And so right now they can find me on Instagram, obviously at the handles that you had listed. It's Damian.McGee. They can find the book if they want to on Amazon. Just search my name. It'll pop up, move over. I'm driving. So that's out there as well. But anybody, just have them find my page, send me a DM. All my stuff is open. My DMs are open. Send me a message, ask me questions. I love to chat, love to meet people, and love to help people, get to where they're going or find a new community. I guarantee you, once you get around people who think differently, you want differently, you act differently, you get differently.
Right.
It's just everything changes.
Absolutely. Man, it has been such a pleasure talking to you again.
I love it. I love talking to you.
I love talking to you, man, because you always give us the nuggets that we need. As always, Heal Black Joy community, thank you guys for tuning in to our Thursday talks that we did on Wednesday due to the holidays. Make sure that you follow us at Heal Black Joy on Instagram, TikTok, as well as Facebook. And also our website is going to be relaunching. So go click in our bio to find and sign up for our relaunch. But thank you again, Damian.
Thank you. Anytime.
Wonderful. I really appreciate you speaking with us. And
Absolutely.
to everybody that's on, thank you guys for joining us on tonight and engaging in this conversation. And until next week, you guys make sure to please heal your Black joy. Have a good
Bye
one.
bye.
Bye.